day 8 of the 2024 U.S. Senior and U.S. Junior Championships saw a dramatic penultimate round as we had one champion crowned in the U.S. Senior, while in the U.S. Junior and U.S. Girls Junior, everything is left to play for heading into the final tomorrow. Starting with the U.S. Senior, Grandmaster Vladimir Akopian clinched event victory with a win over Douglas Root, making Akopian the 2024 U.S. Senior Champion, as with 6.5 out of 8, he can no longer be caught. However, the battle for silver rages on as Grandmaster Jesse Kraai jumped into clear second place with 5 points out of 8 after a third straight win, this one over GM Alex Shabalov. In the U.S. Junior, top seed and leader Christopher Yu drew a critical game against one of his main rivals in Jason Wang. Meanwhile, the other player a half point behind Christopher, Grandmaster Andrew Hong, survived an absolutely lost position against Brewington Hardaway to keep his chances alive. Yu continues to lead with 6 out of 8 going into tomorrow's final round, with Andrew Hong and Jason Wang both a half point behind on 5.5. Finally, in the U.S. Girls Junior, Alice Lee continued to break away with a win over Zoe Tang, her 4th victory in a row. Meanwhile, her co-leader Rose Atwell nearly lost but ended up escaping with a draw against Jasmine Su. Alice now leads for the first time in the event with 6 out of 8, with Atwell going into tomorrow's final round a half point behind on 5.5. Jumping into the games, we'll start with the key game in the U.S. Senior between Douglas Root here playing white against Vladimir Akopian. This was the key game that allowed Akopian to clinch victory in this section with 1 round to spare. This one starts off as a semi-Slav. Here we get DC4 and C5, typical play here from black. And knight to E5, an early jump with the knight, quite provocative. After bishop D6 takes, queen takes D7, would have run into bishop to B5 stuff, so black takes with the knight, rook to D1, C takes D4. Here, apparently, white needed to play knight to B5, where he might be a little bit better, hitting the pawn and, of course, the bishop on D6. White will win back the pawn and stands all right. Instead, we saw rook takes D4, bishop E5, and knight B5 in this order, but this doesn't work as well for white. Black could take on D4, and here white would be sacrificing an exchange after knight D6 check and E takes D4. Things would be a bit unclear. But much stronger is what Akopian plays in the game, simply castling, getting out of the check, and leaving the attack alive on the rook. Rook D1 and now rook to C8, and already white is experiencing huge difficulties here. Black has threats of A6, B5, as well as just bishop to D5 winning material. So queen E2 is played unpinning, but this allows black to execute the other trick in the position. Bishop takes H2 check, winning a pawn because after queen H4 check, black is able to recapture on C4. This position is now objectively winning for black, but it did take some very nice technique from Vladimir in order to win this one. Rook takes C1 played, queen takes A6. Material here is staying as it was. Black is going to have a healthy extra pawn after these complications. Knight C5. Takes on A7, takes, and queen to B4. So Vladimir decides to give the pawn back, but he gets queen to B4, rook B1, and knight D3, as black's pieces here are extremely active. Queen C7, queen D2, E4. Now apparently queen F2 check would have been quite strong for black, followed by F5, activating the rook on the king side. But instead, Vladimir goes for the technical route, takes on B2, queen to C2 now, forcing a queen trade. It wasn't technically forced, but black goes for the endgame, takes, knight to c4, and black maintains a very healthy extra pawn in this rook and knight endgame. And from here, Vladimir's technique is quite nice, starting with g5, fixing the dark squares on the king side. He simply just starts improving the position as white tries to trade off his weakness on the queen side. But after takes, black doesn't go for the rook endgame, instead goes knight to e5, and this resulting endgame is super difficult for white. As black's pieces are very, very active, black is up the extra pawn, and of course the rook and the knight are going to combine to go after white's king side. This is essentially what happens. Rook to b2, white defends the second rank, but now g4 takes, throws in the check, king h2, knight takes g4, and king to g5. Black has now ideas of mating white with h4, rook f1 ideas, and so on. So rook b3 here played. Rook c3, of course, was even more pertinent threat. and now h4 check, rook c2, e5, creating an escape square for the king. But now king to f5, and white resigned here as mate is simply unstoppable. The rook f2 coming next. So with this win, Akopian does clinch the 2024 US Senior. His third attempt at winning this tournament. He played the first 2 times the previous 2 years as the top seed. Finally, he is able to win this year's US Senior. Moving on to the US Junior, we'll start with the key game between Jason Wang and Christopher Yu. Jason, of course, going into this game a half point behind Christopher and desperately needing a win here. He opts for the Catalan, and the players go down a very, very sharp and theoretical line. Seems like both players were quite well prepared here as they blitzed out the following moves. dc5, bishop a6, knight e3. Very, very complicated opening. You'll definitely have to check the engines to get the full evaluation on this one. After c6, rook to c8, bishop f4. Again, both players continuing to blitz out moves. Rook to d1, d4, h4, rook to e8, and finally knight d2 here. This is where one of the players at least started spending some time on this move, knight to d2. Situation is very, very complicated with white having a really strong c-pawn, but of course black having active pieces as well. So bishop takes e2 played by Christopher. He's still playing quite fast. Rook to c1, bishop to d3. And here white actually had a chance. He plays queen to d1, allowing bishop to d6, but it would have been much stronger for him to throw in c7. Hitting black's queen, black is forced to either move the queen with queen to d7 or go for complications with queen takes c7. But this one I believe is working out well for white after queen takes d3, knight takes d3, rook takes c7. And it looks like white is getting a very nice endgame in this line. Instead, after c7, if queen d7, then white could play queen to d1 here. And now bishop to d6 is different because white already got c7 in here. So for example, the engine shows rook takes c5 as being a nice resource for white. Point being bishop takes c5, knight to b3, both bishops hanging, and looks like white is winning material. We'll have 2 pieces for the rook and a big, big advantage. So a bit of a missed opportunity here by Jason as he goes queen d1, bishop to d6, and now white still has the advantage here, but it's not as much. Knight f3, bishop e4, queen takes d4, queen takes c6. Here white's last chance was to grab this pawn on b4 to get the edge with an extra pawn. The point is that if bishop takes f3, white can just take back. After queen f3, rook takes c5. White does have an extra pawn in this heavy piece endgame. Definitely a lot of work to do to actually convert it, but a long-term advantage for white, no doubt. Instead, we saw knight to e5, where after rook takes e5, queen e5, bishop takes g2, everything gets liquidated here as the players get into a rook endgame with equal pawns. And they played this one out for some time, but long story short, neither player was able to generate any winning chances here, and eventually this game was drawn. So with the draw, Christopher keeps his lead with 6 out of 8. Jason Wang half point behind. Going into this round, Andrew Hong playing black in this game could have caught Christopher with a win, but he got into some very, very serious trouble against Brewington Hardaway. At this point, white has a very, very nice attack going on the king side. Here, Brewington finds a fantastic exchange sacrifice, knight to g4, basically forcing black to take this rook on f5. After rook takes f5, black's king is in a world of hurt here. King h8, rook h5, and white should have been completely winning in this one. In fact, was winning, repeats a couple of times, plays the move knight e5, very strong, threatening knight f7 check, for example, as well as queen h6 and knight to g6. And Andrew somehow manages to survive and avoid losing outright, even though his king is in huge danger here. Queen takes d5, queen takes e4 check. At this point, white has a knight and 4 pawns for the rook, which is just a completely winning material advantage. Something very strange happens in this game. After queen g3, white gives a couple checks, wins a fifth pawn for the rook. So knight and 5 pawns, tons of material. But here, after giving a couple checks, Brewington plays knight to d5. Of course, at this point, the players are playing on increment. They only have basically 2 minutes here left. Knight to d5 allows black some very serious counterplay with rook takes c2. Instead, simple solution for white would have been to play the move queen d2, defending both pawns that are hanging here. And from here, white should be able to slowly consolidate and win the position c4, queen f2, and so on. Just way too much extra material for white. Instead, we see knight d5, rook takes c2. All of a sudden, the win is no longer so simple as black is threatening mate on g2. If knight f4, then queen takes e3 with check, and white loses. So Brewington gives a couple of checks, but keeps looking for the win. Eventually finds queen to f1, the only way to keep the game going. Now b4, f5. I think e4 here was better for white, which would have prevented f5 and cemented the knight on d5. But b4, f5, and now white's route to victory here is very, very slim. He had to play in this position, knight e7 check, I believe is winning. Where after king d8, check, king e8, white has queen e5, takes, trading into this endgame with knight and the 4 pawns against the rook. It would actually still require some work as black's rook is very, very active, but I believe this one offered white the final winning chance. Instead, Brewington gives check on a8, but now after king to d8, white basically has nothing better than a possible perpetual here. King to e7. Now he goes queen to e5. This is actually the only move in the position. Queen e5, forcing the queen trade. But now white's pawns are all weak. The knight is trapped in the corner, and white's extra material here quickly gets liquidated. Unfortunately for Andrew, despite surviving this one, he's not really able to generate any winning chances as the knight against the rook is very, very solid. He does manage to hold on to his 1 pawn in the position, but this endgame is a pretty simple draw for white to hold. Unfortunately for black, there's just no way to break through with the king and rook against the knight here. Andrew did try for many, many moves, and eventually this one even came down to rook versus knight, but ultimately he wasn't able to create any chances, and this game ended up drawn. So going into the final round tomorrow, Andrew Hong and Jason Wang will both be trailing Christopher Yu by a half point. They will need Christopher to not only not win this game, but then they'll need to win in order to possibly catch up and force a playoff for Friday. Next up in the U.S. Girls Junior, going into this round, we had 2 co-leaders, Alice Lee and Rose Atwell, both sitting on 5 out of 7. And Alice is playing against Zoe Tang in this one of the top players in the event. She grabs the bishop pair early on, but in general, black was doing quite fine in this middle game. Queen to c2, maybe f4, e5. That was the way for white to actually fight for an advantage here. Alice plays this one a bit slow with the bishop pair, and eventually black actually manages to get into a pretty equal endgame here. After h4, takes, knight e8, f4. Black starts coming in on the dark squares, and a lot of pressure on the d file, forcing white to try and trade everything off. Eventually we get a bunch of trades here, and after takes, white has rook and bishop against rook and knight, but black's rook is very active here, and objectively black should be totally fine. However, soon Zoe does get into some troubles here as white brings all the pieces over to the queen side. Now rook to c3, putting pressure on the c-pawn. Here knight b5, rook c1, black takes here, takes. Probably b5 should have been played for black, where I think black is fairly safe. Instead, she takes on c5, does Zoe. And after rook takes c5, white's rook here gets very, very active with rook to c7, e5. And now white just needs to bring the bishop to this diagonal, and black is going to have huge issues defending the king side. So this one is no longer an easy hold for black. And objectively, Zoe had some chances to draw here. I think knight c4 is a blunder. Bishop f3 was possible, immediately followed by bishop to d5. I believe this was very good for white. Instead, we see bishop to e2. Black had other moves here as well, like rook to g2, knight c2. Engine says black is holding, but again, things are very, very difficult here already. And what we get in the game, bishop e2, black gives some checks, king to g4, knight e3 check, and knight comes to f5. Here Alice takes on b5. Actually would have been stronger to give this check first and then take on b5. The difference is in the game, she takes on b5. Black had one saving move here, king to g8, in order to be able to hide with the king on h7 here and not walk into this mating net. The white is starting rook b8 check, king e7, and then rook e8 mate on the spot. That's why white should have thrown in the check first, so that black wouldn't have king to g8 as a defense in this position. Instead, Zoe takes on g3, which ends up being the losing mistake here. It's after king to h2, black is not only in danger of getting mated, but white also has ideas of playing bishop d7 and just going after the knight, or bishop to c4, followed by going after f7. So if king g8, bishop c4, for instance, and white is completely winning here, his f7 is falling, and then the e-pawn is going to be really, really strong. So f6 is tried by Zoe, but now check, king f7, bishop e8 check. Alice very, very accurate in this final phase of the game. Bishop takes g6. Now the knight on f5 is hanging, which is defending the rook on g3, and black is losing material. So Zoe tried fe5, hoping to trade off all the pawns so that she can get into a drawn rook and bishop against rook endgame, but it's simply not to be. After check, check, and rook takes f5, white manages to keep one pawn on the board, which of course here is enough to win. And Alice, very, very precise until the end, finds rook e5, rook to e3, otherwise black gets mated here. This wasn't the only way to win. White could, of course, just keep the g-pawn alive, and she should be winning here as well. But this one was very precise, as black is forced to play rook e3, and now white is able to go for the rook trade in this endgame where she is having an extra bishop and is winning. Now, it's actually not that simple here. If white's pawn were to push up to g6, that endgame would actually be a draw, as there'd be no way for white to approach black's king and pawn without allowing a stalemate. Here, however, because white hasn't committed the pawn to g5, Alice demonstrated the proper winning technique here. King f8 would be a draw immediately because of stalemate. But king e8, king g8, and now bishop drops back, king h8, and king f7. The key resource here, putting black's king in a stalemate so that black is forced to play g6. Now white takes the pawn with the king. Now with the bishop, that would be another stalemate. But king takes g6, and now it's all over. In fact, black resigned here, as she no longer has any chances. All white needs to do is avoid the stalemate, but that's very, very easy to do with the knight pawn. Of course, if this was a rook pawn, that would be another draw. But here with the knight pawn, white is just immediately winning. Bishop e6 check. G7 is also good. The pawn is just promoting, and game over. So with that win, Alice took the clear lead. The only player that could catch up to her would be Rose Atwell if she had won this game against Jasmine Su. But Rose was in fact in trouble throughout this game and found herself in this rook and bishop endgame down a pawn where black should have been completely lost. However, she does find a miraculous escape here. So rook g5, g4, h5. Here white finds a very nice move, rook to b5, either forcing a rook trade or winning the second pawn, after which things would be over. So black went for this same color bishop endgame where white is completely winning, just this b-pawn is too strong and white's king and bishop are too active. But takes, check this out, king d7, h4, king e6, h5, king to d5. And here white has, I think, different ways to win. The most straightforward would be to just push b6. For example, the bishop drops somewhere like d6, b7, and if black tries to go after this pawn, otherwise bishop a7, for example, and white can win this way. White can also try to break through on the king side. If black goes for king to c6, white can play like king at e4, king f5, for example. Most straightforward would be g5, just breaking through. For example, takes, king b7, h6, and that's it. Black's bishop won't be able to stop the pawn. So white was winning here in a rather straightforward way, but Jasmine goes for bishop takes f6. Surprising decision. It makes sense after gf6, h6. How does black stop the h-pawn? And if bishop e5, well then there's b6. And here after king to c6, for example, white goes king to e4. And next is king to f5. And black can pick up the b-pawn, but will be losing. For example, h7 here is winning. King f5 I think is even cleaner, where black can no longer stop the pawn. Instead, however, Rose doesn't play bishop e5. She finds f5. Fantastic defensive resource. And the point is that now the bishop won't be blocked. The bishop comes to e5 to cover the pawns. And after h7, bishop e5, gf, king to c5, it turns out that this is a draw. King e4, the bishop drops back. Now white's king is stuck. Black is ready to take this one and then bring the king back. So b6, the only try for white, takes king to d5. White's king does manage to get in, but it turns out this is a drawn position after king to d7. The key resource here being after king g8, black can give the bishop, just leave it in the corner with king to e8. Might not be the only drawing move here. King to e7 draws as well with the same idea, but basically black has to give the bishop. And after king takes f8, king f8, it turns out white has two extra pawns, but is never winning this position as the king is just not getting out of the corner. So king f8, f6, king f7, stalemate on the board, and a draw was agreed. So absolute miracle defense here by Rose to find this move f5, without which she would definitely have lost this game. And with the draw, Rose manages to stay within half a point of Alice Lee going into tomorrow's final round. So similar situation in the US Junior and US Girls Junior. You have one player that's half a point ahead, and then two players in the US Junior chasing, one player in the US Girls Junior chasing the leader. So it's all going to come down to tomorrow's round to see if we have a playoff in either of these sections. So that takes us into tomorrow's final round, where there will be plenty to play for. A number of seniors are fighting for second place in the US Senior, and in the US Junior, US Girls Junior, we have a couple leaders that are only half a point ahead, which means several players will have chances to possibly force a playoff on Friday. Should be a very, very exciting final round. Hopefully you folks will tune in, and hopefully I'll catch you in the recap later on as well. Until then, take care.